You wrote a book about the Bill Henson affair.
Yes.
And when Mr. Rudd commented on it, I can't remember his exact words, but
Absolutely
they were
revolting.
Absolutely revolting. So I wonder, David, whether what you make of what you call the prudery of the Mr. Rudd and his government, and how much you dislike it.
It's funny, you know, I just sort of think of it as another strange factor in the life of this country, that this prudery exists. It's not uncontested in the government. I think there's more to Rudd's response to the Henson photographs than prudery.
You say it's linked to his childhood. I didn't quite know what you meant.
Well, Rudd has an absolutely passionate and winning, for the most part, response to children, and particularly to children in peril. The apology speech, which will survive, I think, as one of the great pieces of oratory in the history of this country, that is about imperiled children. Yes, they're black children, but they're imperiled children. And I think that is the source of his absolute human commitment to that cause. His response to the Henson photographs, I think, is coarse and misjudged, but I think it comes from the same source.
Feeling the child is vulnerable.
Feeling that the child is vulnerable. And from his point of view, being utterly baffled that a child would place herself in that position, that an artist would want a child placed in that position. Now, I think that that's a very narrow view, as you know, and we differ on this. But the prudery of this country is just one of the continuing and often immensely comic aspects of life in Australia. The other day, the Classification Board allowed the release of Pasolini's film Sarlo on DVD. Now, the battle over Sarlo goes all the way back to the making of that film, which is something over 40 years ago. It was allowed in Australia. It was banned in Australia. But just recently, the Classification Board has said, you know, we'll allow it to be shown in DVD. There are almost no countries on earth left that ban Sarlo. But Sarlo is like the battle of the Somme of censorship in Australia. And so it's been allowed by the Classification Board. There was an appeal to the Review Board. The Review Board allowed it. And there is in Canberra a cabal of senior politicians who are in meltdown over Sarlo. And that's the prudery of this country. I think I would admire prudery more if it wasn't usually a cover for lies. I would admire
but
it
it doesn't make you hostile to Mr. Rudd.
No, it doesn't make me hostile to Mr. Rudd at all. I'm interested in his prudery. When he was at university, he was actually a campaigning prude. And one of the things that we talked about on the beach at Mackay was Calvin's Geneva. He's a very interesting man. He's enormously widely read. And we talked about the nature of politics in utopias. Yes. He's a man of very straightforward, conservative, social instincts. And that's fine by me. I'll criticise him when I think they're absurd, but that's fine by me. And I think that's all genuine. That's not a manufactured part of himself. A lot of himself is manufactured, put together from bits and pieces. That's not.
Because time is flying, some questions I want to ask towards the heart of your essay, and I think its most important contribution. And that is really the breakdown of process in government, which I'd read bits and pieces in the newspapers about, but I think you've captured it more vividly and more plausibly and persuasively than anyone I've read. You say two things. One is the breakdown of process. The other is the incredible unpopularity of him in Canberra. I would like you to speak about both things.
Well, the breakdown of process. We might, it might be something we develop more. But that marvellous journalist who now writes for the Australian Financial Review, Laura Tingle, was the one who was able to report this government has barely leaked in its first term. The security of information has been astonishing. The loyalty of people to the government itself has been astonishing. But Laura Tingle got this amazing leak about the nature of cabinet government in Australia now, which is that cabinet ministers arrive in the cabinet room to find a folder in front of them, a folder of documents they are not allowed to take away, a folder of documents which records the decisions that have already been made by what's known as the Gang of Four, which is Rudd, Gillard, Swan and Tanner. They cop it. Well, they've copped it up to a point and then they leaked it. But several other things have broken down as well. And the main thing, to my mind, that has broken down is the tradition or the practice of circulating proposals to all ministers a fortnight before they come up for cabinet, so that everybody can look at them and think about them, and so that ministers can talk to their own departments about them, in order to, is this sensible? Is this a good idea? It's scrutiny across the cabinet. That's disappeared. Rudd's own office is the office in which all major decisions have to be taken, in which all of in the minds of the government, crucial decisions about when announcements are made. And the protocol of announcements is incredibly important for this government. The restriction of information to a very, very small number of cabinet ministers is partly about wanting to be the absolute controllers of information, partly about Rudd's own wish to be at the centre of things. Well, he's the Prime Minister, for God's sake. He's got to be at the centre of things. But he is, to an extent, that has broken down the structure of cabinet government as we understand it. And it seems to me that one of the challenges for his ministers is to simply insist on governing, that Australia must be governed in the way it is traditionally governed by cabinet. And that is not happening at the moment. Your second question?
No. I've got two more questions, then I really do want to open up the floor. But two things I must ask you. The first is this, that when he said he would abandon the ETS, the normal interpretation, one you make and one I would have made, had I written about it at the time, is that this comes from risk averseness, that he is a coward. When he announced 3 or 4 days later the new mining tax, the most obvious interpretation is to say that he's crazy brave.
Yep.
How could he take on the most powerful lobby in the country without any political preparation of public opinion and so on? How do we account for this apparent contradiction? Risk averseness on Friday, crazy brave on Tuesday.
The spine of the essay is, in a sense, his handling of global warming. It begins in Copenhagen and sort of politically ends with the abandonment of the ETS. And at every stage in that process, I was fascinated by the contradiction between high moral purpose and cowardice. By the time the negotiations with Malcolm Turnbull had finished, it seemed to me that he had given away everything worth fighting for. And, brown coal, burn it forever, and here's billions of dollars to help you burn it. I mean, it was just ludicrous. And so a good deal of the essay is about the question of courage. The crazy brave brawl with the miners is, of course, about judgment and technique. It seems to me that the interesting character of this man plays itself out most in problems of technique because of his overwhelming sense of being the brightest person in any room on earth, because of his problems of trust, because of the way he works with people, government has evolved in the way it's evolved with a good deal of difficulties. But there's also a question of Rudd, the question of judgment. And a part of the essay is about his time as the chief bureaucrat for Wayne Goss in Queensland, because I must say it was one of the things that got him a bit upset at Mackay. I'm interested in whether his government in Canberra is going to go the same way as Wayne Goss's in Queensland. And talking to people who worked with him in Queensland, you always have this sense of how this question kept coming up with these people of Rudd's political judgment, that he was doing in Queensland things that needed to be done, cried out to be done, after 30 years of misgovernment under the Nationals in Queensland. But the Goss government in general, and Rudd in particular, kept stumbling politically as these things were done. I'm not talking about the road that was going to kill koalas. Rudd actually had nothing to do with that. But what he did for Goss made Rudd enormously unpopular in Queensland, even though on paper, when you look at what he did, you think that's absolutely admirable that he did those things. They had to be done. But the way in which he did it, the particular way in which he did it, was politically ham-fisted. And that seems to be what we're now looking at with the miners' brawl, though questions of technique are not now at the centre, I think, of what we should be paying attention to in the miners' brawl, because the miners' brawl is actually a brawl between mining and government in Australia now. And BHP and Rio want to break this government. They don't want to break the tax proposal. They want to get rid of the government. They want to get rid of Rudd. This is a really interesting brawl in the history of this country. We're back where we were with Chifley and the banks in the late 1940s, and it's not about the shape of the tax, it's about the shape of our politics.
Now, my final question, and then I'll open out to the audience for 15 minutes. My final question is this. I think, and you've told me there is evidence for this, that Rudd was shattered by the response to his withdrawal ETS. And I feel that he is a sort of shattered man at the moment. My question is there any coming back for him? I'm not asking the gallery question, is will he win the next election or will his government win them? But can he regain the opinion of both the political class and the country? Or has he had it?
No, he hasn't had it. He hasn't had it. Rudd is a person who has been underestimated at every single stage of his career.
I'm used to saying that, Hitler.
Yeah, he's underestimated. And he has learnt to be what he has wanted to be at each stage of his career. Not a lot comes naturally to Rudd, but he is a hard taskmaster of himself. He taught himself to be a bureaucrat. He taught himself to be a Labor candidate. He taught himself to be a member of caucus. He taught himself to be a leader of the opposition. Now, there's no other way on earth to learn to be a Prime Minister but by being a Prime Minister, and I think he's capable of teaching himself to be a Prime Minister. What the public requires from him are some wins. The health stuff was a mess. Everybody, I think, can now sort of understand it's a mess, and the refusal of Western Australia to come in on that mess devalued it greatly for Rudd. But at least it wasn't a complete disaster for him. If he wins this fight with the mines, we will look back on these months and wondered why we so doubted him. Because what he requires politically, and probably personally, is a big win. And it's not for nothing that this man's an admirer of Gough Whitlam, because I think what we're watching at the moment is crash through or crash.
Yeah, but we know what happens.
And if he crashes through, his standing politically and personally will be immensely restored. But he won't any longer be what we thought he was before he became Prime Minister. We'll have a better understanding of what he is, of his strengths and weaknesses. But I think it would be very, very foolish of people to write this man off.
Questions? Now, I'm not quite sure how it's to be organised. There are microphones which are important for you to use.
This room goes on forever. It's true.
The what?
This room goes on forever. There are microphones?
In regard to running the mining issue, I can't remember who the economist was who was referring to it, but he put forward the proposition that the reason the mining companies are running so heavily on this issue is because they see Australia as a trendsetter, and that if it gets away in Australia, there's a possibility of it having a domino effect in other less advantaged countries. Just wondering what you think of that.
As these rows go on over time, weeks after weeks after weeks, there's a bit of a temptation to try to find fresh reasons for what's going on. That's a gorgeous reason. That's a really gorgeous reason. But there is a much simpler reason. They don't want to give the money to the government.
I mean, if I'm allowed to say, I actually think there's more to the question than David does, in that these are multinational companies, and if Australia can impose this tax, then many other countries where they also mine will impose the tax. So they don't want to pay the money to the Australian government, but they definitely don't want to pay it to half a dozen other
They don't
governments.
want to pay it to anybody.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's why it could set a really dangerous precedent, I think.
I attended a conference in Monash some 8 or 9 years ago when Lord Desai, who at that stage I think was in his early 80s, addressed a group about governance generally and politics in the broader sense, and made the comment that following Churchill's comment that democracy was the best of a bad bunch of systems, that his view on it was somewhat similar, that it is the best of a bad bunch of systems, but he highlighted the point that it was because it gets rid of those quicker than any other alternative system. I just wonder, in terms of your assessment and evaluation of Rudd, is the democratic process that you just alluded to, that he may well become the strongest leader that we've ever had in that sense, might lead him to also perhaps be one of the most scary leaders that we'd ever have.
I wouldn't argue that in organisational terms, he's certainly the strongest Labor leader for about half a century. Probably you have to go back to the wartime Labor leaders to find a Labor Prime Minister that exerts such absolute organisational control over the party. And there might even be an argument that he exerts more than those wartime leaders. That's organisational power. One of the many fascinating things about this man is the question of whether he is actually able to employ the power that he has done so much to acquire. Is he actually good with power? Can he make power work for him? And there are some questions about that, and there are people who I quote in the essay who say, no, he's not very good at it. He likes to hoard it, he doesn't like to spend it. And with Rudd, there is, I think, a confusion between control and power. They're not the same thing, but I think he thinks that they are the same thing. The great thing about democracies is that we can look at our leaders and work out what they're really like. And the scrutiny of the Australian community of leaders is ruthless, really ruthless. Now, it doesn't mean that you necessarily get rid of somebody you dislike, but we get to know them pretty well, and we deal with them on that basis. The scrutiny of the Australian people of Tony Abbott is ruthless, and they don't like him.
Can you comment on the government's decision to advertise in relation to its RSPT policy? So I think this decision has the potential to be a blight on our democracy for such a long period of time, where governments can just go ahead and spend public money on what is effectively political advertising when it hasn't been legislated. Do you share similar views?
I've probably got more vicious views on this than you, Robert. I mean, I just think that it is really shabby of the government to be doing this, particularly when they promised that they would not. And I think it's very regrettable. Two other little things, though. I think they should get a better advertising agency if they're going to do it. And I can understand the temptation when you see the ruthless campaign of the miners. Maybe there's an argument to say that you've got to fight out these policy issues in public through advertising. But these people, the Labor Party pledged hand on heart that is not what they would do, and they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me to highlight one thing about Rudd, which is that he often speaks, particularly when he's an opposition leader, speaks from the moral high ground without doing what trained politicians are meant to do, which is thinking, what will this mean in 5 years when I'm in power? And for him to say that meant that he couldn't do it. And then when he did it, I think it looks disgraceful. And you're not tougher than me on this. I think there should be a taxpayers' revolt. I think everyone who pays GST should withhold that proportion from them and go to prison. But anyhow, I suggested this during work choices, and I suggest it again without any...
He's got a taste for martyrdom too.
Little amounts.
Because of the ruthlessness of Australian politics of which you spoke, do you think it's inevitable that we're always going to be disappointed in our leaders?
Oh, of course. I mean, disappointment comes with the game. Every changes of government occur because a new leader comes along who can harvest the hopes of the nation. And grown-ups know that a good many of those hopes will inevitably be disappointed. And skilled politicians, part of the great skill of politics is to let your supporters down lightly when you do disappoint them. Now, I don't advance any of that to excuse failures and breaking promises and lies and any of that kind of thing, but hopes in politics are always disappointed. And of course, events move on, things change, high hopes. With the best will in the world, high hopes can just be completely dashed. Would we have a disagreement there?
No.
The
melancholy conclusion is mine too.
Yes,
although I do think that there were all sorts of hopes alive with Keating. And it's not. I actually think now we have a particularly bad time in our politics where both leaders have disappointed in different ways, or both leaders are, in some ways, one has disappointed and the other is beyond the pale. For example, I think that during the Fraser years, Fraser was hated, but the Vietnamese boats started arriving. And neither side took advantage of it. Your idea of this oasis of racism under the surface. It was an incredibly good time in which Labor didn't exploit, and Fraser behaved with exemplary humanity in regard to that. So there are times in which I think our politicians have raised hopes rather than destroyed them. But in general, I think it is true that our hopes are dashed on the reality of life.
And the disappointments associated with this man are profound because he did suggest.
That's what I think is so interesting about your essay, and what's so interesting about Kevin Rudd, that he did kind of raise hopes. And your essay, I think, is the first really important attempt to work out why they were disappointed. And it's, as I said at the beginning, prophetic in that you wrote before the full disappointments came through. Most of it was written before the ETS retreat. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Is it up? Yeah. This essay seems to have courted a lot of praise and controversy and attention, mainly because people know so little about Kevin Rudd the person. You spoke earlier about the fact that, you know, Canberra politicians and Canberra journalists have the type of relationship where there are certain things that are reported and certain things that aren't. Do you think that the media is partly to blame for this gap in our knowledge of our leaders and our, you know, the personalities of these people who are holding the reins?
You can always blame the media. But people take time to know, and this man is a hard man to know. And there are millions of words written about this man since he first decided to tell his story, which was in the beginning of 2003, to Michael Gordon at The Age. And that's the first time Rudd starts to talk about who he really is and what his life story is. And I think it was very painful for him to talk about that. And so it's a process that's only 7 or 8 years old, and it's going to go on and on. And as as the elections come up, there's going to be more character studies of Rudd and more attempts to bottle him and get it right. I've made one of these attempts, and I think it has brought some aspects of his character and life back to people, but I don't think the press can be blamed. I mean, I can't praise myself, and I can't blame everybody else. But it does, as I say, it does leave me free. I am free to, come and go in Canberra, and I don't have to deal with this man ever again if I don't have to.
It occurs to me actually that the feeling that, and you put it in the essay, and many people have said this, that we don't know Kevin Rudd. It occurs to me that maybe the reason we don't know him or feel we don't know him is that he doesn't altogether know himself, that there's something less solid or more problematic about him than Hawkey or about Keating or about John Howard and I could go on, Malcolm Fraser, that there's something, as it were, mysterious in the end near his centre to do with uncertainty about himself or what he is.
There's a statement I make right near the end of the essay, which I think might be wrong. I think it might be wrong. I was talking to him about himself, and I say once or twice he shies away from questions, declaring he's just not a reflective person. I don't believe him. I sense no one is more curious about the mysteries of Rudd than Rudd himself. I think I might not be right there. I think he is aware that there are mysteries there, but I suspect curiosity is not the right word. I think he fends them off. He has often said in interviews, and good interviews with good people, he's often said when cornered, "Oh look, I'm just not a reflective person." And I've read that as an excuse. I think it is in part an excuse, but I think in part it's probably true as well, that he doesn't want to go somewhere. He doesn't want to actually go to some of those places.
Yeah, that's mainstream.
And the big question really, and is whether there is anything there to go to.
We're all humans, and there is always, I think, something.
There is always something to go to, but how coherent it is when you get there is perhaps the question. That's
such a good point to end. That I will. I'm sorry if there were questions to come. It is my sworn duty to point out that there are many copies of David's splendid essay at the end of this extremely long room, and that David will go through the long march to get there and will sign them. So can I ask you to thank him for a splendid performance?
Thank you.